investment for the United States to make at this time in collaboration with global partners. Last thing I'll say is if you don't want to remember anything I just said, this is the title I wish I had, right? Adapting a user-centered philosophy, or how I learned to stop worrying about climate change models and help people make adaptation decisions, with apologies to Stanley Kubrick. So, thanks.
You've got more to say?
I got more to say.
Good.
Well, you said a half hour. I think we're still well under a half hour. And I won't be very long. Raj really addressed what was the core of the first section of the paper, the better information, and to queue up a set of agenda items. I have a sort of a different brief, which is to focus on the second section of the paper, which is the RD&D agenda for adaptation. And Dan, you opened the window to talk about the Washington Advisory Group, so I'll spend just a minute on that. The Washington Advisory Group was founded in 1996. Basically, Bob White, who was the president of the Academy of Engineering, was a driving force behind that. And he gathered together a bunch of very senior guys, and they invited me to join them primarily because they needed somebody to go get coffee. That's not true, but it was an adventure where I was probably junior to them by about 30 years in most cases, and we had a great run. It was a lot of fun. The one thing that I learned, both at the Academy and then at the Washington Advisory Group, is that if you identify a problem, there is no economic argument that stands in the way of applying the research and development approach to it. So in the same way that there are in the community of climate scientists, as you heard earlier, these objections about don't talk about this because it reduces the pressure on mitigation, there is a logic in the R&D world which says, you know, the government can't pick winners and losers. We shouldn't invest in research and development because there are a variety of different logics which say the government should stay away from that sort of thing and leave it to the private sector. Well, in my bones, both from the Academy and then from decades at the Washington Advisory Group, I just don't care. It's just wrong. The answer is there are a set of problems and there are very few barriers to intelligent application of research and development to those problems. And that really is the spirit of the second section of the paper. As we point out in the paper, backing off from what I would call aggressive recommendations, the whole discussion in the paper is really about, we don't know how much RD&D is actually focused on adaptation questions because there hasn't been what you would call either a national or a global, it's not a collaboration effort, but at least a cataloging of what's going on in adaptation in an effective way. And I don't want to belabor that. You know, the primary recommendation in the paper is about paying some attention to adaptation as a goal for research development and demonstration. Rather, I'd like to contrast what's going on in mitigation to what I think should be going on in adaptation by giving a couple of quick examples. In energy, there is a international, multinational, state-level collaboration in research on alternative energy called Mission Innovation, which is a substantial commitment of public resources to energy, advancing the alternative energy futures. And it includes, I don't know, 23 different countries that are actually investing resources and focusing on it. Similarly, there's a private sector initiative called, I can remember this, Breakthrough Energy Coalition, which includes the famous and rich from Jeff Bezos to Jack Ma and Bill Gates that are investing in exactly the same thing, which is alternative energy with the goal of mitigation as the motivating force behind it. It's hard to find that level of attention and focus in adaptation. And so I have three ideas. I'm not sure they're the best ideas, but they're three areas where it's obvious to me that the application of research and development resources and effort make a lot of sense. And they can be adaptation focused, but some of these have other aspects. The first one is the built environment, especially infrastructure. For those of you who've studied or thought about the construction industry, it is a R&D light industry. It's very decentralized. Most of the innovation is done by materials suppliers rather than by the construction industry themselves. And what I would call, there's a huge opportunity for a wide variety of research and development focused, whether it's from materials or different applications of control technologies through construction project management, but particularly in what I would call retrofitting infrastructure. It's very different if you're going to build an airport than if you're going to raise it by 2 feet. It's very different than if you're going to lay rail tracks than if you're going to refit them in such a way that they can handle the new heat environment that they're operating in. And that alone, I think, is an excellent opportunity for both a national and then perhaps an international collaboration across RD&D. Second one is obvious, and it's an area that I know relatively little about, but it's public health. Public health research, whether it's by the CDC, which already has a set of international contacts, or whether it's focused on the disease vectors or clean water. There's a huge public health research agenda that already exists, but is altered by rapid global warming. And it's one of those areas where an international collaboration, whether it's private or public, probably public in this case, focused on public health would be hugely valuable. Now, the third area where I think we could use a focused, large-scale RD&D agenda is in climate-related disaster preparedness and recovery, and risk management, what you call it, for disasters. Once again, there are lots of efforts worldwide. There's a history of the decade of natural hazard reduction. But this whole issue of the change in the natural hazards as a function of global warming is not something that has risen to the level of focusing private and public resources on RD&D to address that. And I'll close with a personal comment, and this is from somebody who is primarily an R&D guy and a science and technologist rather than necessarily a climate person. For those of you who don't live in California, it's big news that the wildfire season is now 12 months a year. So in the last decade, my wife and I built a dream home in Northern California that backs up on a park. And I used to walk out in the morning with my cup of coffee and I'd look at that park and I'd think, oh, this is spectacular. How fortunate I am to be here in America where I managed to secure this little piece of private property next to public lands. And I'm really engaged in this. Now I walk out with my cup of coffee and I imagine a wall of fire coming down through that park to where we live. And it bothers me that there are massive research programs for putting robots in dangerous environments. And we can create, internet-enabled refrigerators. And Amazon, when I buy a barbecue, can recommend that, that I buy barbecue fuel, and that we can control an acres-wide refinery from a small control room. And yet our response to wildfires is to basically drop a bunch of guys with shovels and axes into the face of the fire. So if I ask myself, is there an RD&D agenda in natural disasters of increasing frequency because of climate change? The answer is absolutely yes. And if you want to buy a house in Northern California, be willing to talk about it. All right. Thank you very much. I think that's the end of our presentation.
So what I'd really like to do now is tell all of you to go so I can sit and have a long conversation with you guys, because everything you said really resonated with me in ways that I feel like are very fertile. But instead, I'm going to turn that over to you. But I just want to start with one question that responds to your point about options and how framing the climate change issue and the adaptation issue in terms of options is kind of a liberating perspective. This seems to me to be a really big and important point, because I think a lot of the politics around climate change, the ugly politics around climate change, has been an unspoken narrative around winners and losers, and around who gets to decide what the problem is and how horrible things are going to be. But not to be Pollyannish about it, one could also see climate change as an opportunity for a species that is incredibly able to adapt to adversity, to be creative and deal with a challenge in a way that empowers and advances society. And in fact, I'll just plug another report called Adaptation for a High Energy Planet, part of our climate pragmatism project, that kind of tries to make this case. But could you just talk a little bit about whether there is a politics behind that that could be emerging and how we could drive that? Because it seems to me that could really do a lot more than the literally hundreds of millions that foundations are putting in to try to do things like, change public opinion. So I meant that as a softball, not a hardball. Here, can you guys share your? Do we have another mic, or is this the only one? So yeah, can you share the mic? Please share the mic.
So to the extent that I have any role in this life in advising people who are politicians or policymakers, it seems to me as though adaptation is a softball that everybody is missing. Mitigation is a hard sell for all of the reasons you would expect. It's long term. The consequences are hard to measure. It's critically important. We should charge ahead just as fast as possible. But politically, all of the wins, the easy wins, come from doing things on adaptation because they are immediate. They're local. It's all politics is local. You can fill potholes and stop the impact of flooding in Miami and become a hero politically, and build consensus around the importance to deal with climate change by leading with adaptation rather than with mitigation. And it seems to me as though that's a huge opportunity that the policy community and politicians have missed. And I think the worse the summers get, the more people are realizing that responding to that presents a political opportunity, and that may change opinion more quickly than the foundation's investing.
Yeah, I think I'm just adding to that. So, but it seems two things. One is it seems that a lot of innovation around adaptation is happening at local scales and regional scales. And one of the things we can do is elevate that and surface that. And I think that's a useful thing to be doing. The other thing is adaptation is a really wonderful way to position science as something helpful for people, things people want to do anyway. So instead of sort of the mitigation conversation, which is you should be doing this, and I know you already have 20 other things you're worried about, adaptation sort of allows you to say, I know you're worried about these things, I can help you do those things in a different way and maybe even a better way. And that to me is a really positive opportunity.
Thanks. We're going to talk more about this. Okay, I think now it's time for me to shut up and you all to start asking questions.
Did you say your name?
Okay. Elon Chabai at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Germany and ASU. 2 points about the local aspects, which I think is very important. I really, by the way, very much appreciated what you presented. I think there are a lot of very important points around the local and the options, both of those. The two comments are one, and I'm happy to get some response to this. One is the question of meaning making in local communities. When you're dealing with very different people at different levels of power, resources, time, expertise, etc., in a local context. I mean, obviously local context matters a lot, but also how people make sense of what it is that is on the agenda. I think that takes some real effort to facilitate at the local level, because otherwise very easily the experts dominate the story, and the kind of engagement and the kind of ownership that requires, really, if we're going to deal with these options, it gets lost. Second point, to follow that just as a specific example, I've been working and will be back in a few weeks in indigenous communities in Taiwan and small communities in rural Japan dealing with disaster risk. And there too, the process of really engaging the local community in that and their engagement in thinking on their own terms about the process becomes really important. But then the other part is, how do you merge that? How do you integrate that with global scientific knowledge? So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yes. I'll tell you about a project that I think is very cool that takes this in a really interesting direction. So in the Pamir Mountains of Afghanistan, there's people have a tradition called calendars of the body, and essentially it maps ecological signals onto understanding of sort of human physiology, and it's an empirical tradition and a cultural tradition that has been refined and developed over generations. And it's incredibly well suited to local conditions, right? This is an incredibly mountainous place, so you can go 10 kilometers away and experience a very different kind of climate, which means you have very different kinds of agricultural and cultural practices. And I'm told that, you know, if you marry someone from a village 10 kilometers away, you have to learn a new calendar, right? That's how well, but the sort of the tragedy is because of political events, because of conflict, people haven't been able to use these calendars for 50 or 60 years. And in the process of recovering those calendars and starting to reuse them as kind of a cultural preservation effort led by individuals, they found that they no longer match the signals around them, the climate signals around them. So they reached out to the climate community to ask, essentially, we have this historic tradition of revising our understanding based on our experience, and we would like to incorporate climate science into that historical tradition. And that is a great, I think, example of what you just talked about.
I have sort of a non-response response, which is the local knowledge is often confused by what I would call the national knowledge. And this is as a consumer of information about climate change from national publications. If you just watch the drumbeat of fear-mongering that comes along, it often creates more confusion than anything else. Not putting timescales on predictions, 3 meters of sea level rise, or the other thing I think that often happens is that the local level is brought to the table, not by local events, but by global predictions. And I think that stands in the way of an intelligent approach to what's actually going on at the local level. I think that's a non-response.
I have, in my research, come across references to climate change discussions as early as 1908. My name is Alice Ortuzar, and I represent the Well-Mind Association of Greater Washington. We look at environmental and nutritional influences on mental and physical well-being. And in the research, where references went back to 1908, and some to the 1800s. And in the mid-1800s, Acon and Doyle had an all-battery operated house. And I'm curious as to what the source of the electricity was at that time, and for the World Fair in the 1800s that was celebrating electricity. What was the source of the energy at the time? And weren't there battery-operated cars before the combustion engine gained control and popularity? So can you review some of that early knowledge maybe, and where did we get lost?
I don't know if I have a constructive answer. All I know, I would refer to Wikipedia. I'm afraid when you're talking about the early history of different vehicle approaches, it's really a historical context, very important and interesting, but it's really not what I have anything to. Not knowledge. What do we know how to do then? Well, I guess I'm trying to frame it as a knowledge-based question. What did we know then that might have put us in a different direction? And it's a very good question. I don't have a constructive answer, I'm afraid.
There is a big literature on the way the energy system has evolved and why, both the political and technological influences, which I'd be happy to talk to you about.
Thank you. Lots of questions. This is great.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Debbie. I'm a volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby, and I really appreciate this talk about talking about solutions, because CCL actually trained us to skip to solutions sometimes to deal with the climate anxiety for our listeners. At this year's conference, one of the people I met, I think he was from Charleston, he said, wealthy people used to live on the coastline, but now they're starting to move away from the coastline. And he said that your income level directly affects how far above sea level you live. So I'm not exactly sure about my question, but can you talk a little bit about climate justice and how vulnerable and low-income populations are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and what local adaptation and decision makers can do about that?
All right. It's a great question. We're in this interesting position where in some cities, the only available sort of land that was made available for people with less economic resources for all kinds of reasons, structural racism, all of those things, were low-lying areas of the city, right? And now those are the areas that are most prone to flooding. And there are thoughtless solutions like, well, let's just move everybody out of that area. They shouldn't have built houses there in the first place, without recognizing that sort of historical legacy. I guess it's not a great answer in the sense that it's complete, but I guess two thoughts are: one is that as a community of people with privilege, knowledge is power, right? Science is a kind of knowledge, and we as we develop these research agendas, right, we have a responsibility to be thinking about the relationship between those agendas and the people in power. We're in a system of science where who decides what science to pursue is often driven by who has access to science, who participates in science. So you can end up with a vicious cycle where you have a community of scientists that doesn't mirror the demographics of a region or a country, and then that determines, in part, the scientific agenda. So we have a responsibility to fix that. And I think I'm losing my train of thought because it's a big question and it's an important question. The other thing I'll say is that unusual allies. There was a program, I think, in Minneapolis where the chief resilience officer wanted to make sure that the resilience plans were reflecting some members of communities that didn't typically show up at city meetings, right? And so they ended up partnering with, I think, the NAACP to do advocacy training for communities as a way of enabling them to participate, or helping them, I shouldn't say enabling, helping them to participate in climate discussions. And it's sort of 6 steps away from the climate conversation. It's helping people do things they want to do so that they can then consider climate adaptation and be active and vocal in setting an equitable agenda. Okay. It's a great question. It's a hard one.
Fred Lipschultz, U.S. Global Change Research Program. So I very much like your slide, Raj, but it seems at odds with what you were saying in your linear chain, which is you want to stop worrying about climate change models, but you also made a strong argument for much more local climate information, so that seems to be opposed. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Calling me out on that.
No problem.
It was a little bit tongue-in-cheek. And what I was trying to say is that for me, it's been an important evolution to sort of not only think about climate change models, but also think about this other thing. And my historic sort of background as a climate scientist was kind of to imagine that climate models were God's gift to humanity. And they are. And this is my way of reminding myself that it's also important to think about the context in which they're used and how they're informed. So it's a little bit directed at a reminder to myself to think about the whole chain, not just the climate model. But I definitely don't mean to denigrate or diminish the importance of that as part of it. So.
Well, I would push back and say you're absolutely right. Is that I would argue that waiting for or expecting that kind of localized knowledge to arrive and save the day as a deus ex machina, or as a barrier to actually making adaptation decisions is absolutely what we shouldn't be doing. And so that is spot on. It just didn't map to your process. So I'm agreeing with you here and disagreeing on not there. Exactly.
Linear process was a simplification.
Do you know how to back this up?
Yeah.
Because I have a partial response to this too. Go back to the one which has got the list, the different direct impacts.
That one?
Yeah. These predictions, hazards and risks associated with them, some of them will come out of climate models, maybe. Maybe you can localize to the point. A lot of them won't. That you'll end up doing flood risk because you've put sensors around the city and you develop a trend and understanding of the relationship between precipitation and storm surge and the actual flooding that happens. So I think that Raj did a nice job of presenting that the climate change modeling community needs to adjust. But there are things that are outside of the scope of climate change models that we'll need to have done to be able to address these.
And they're far more fundamental to get done. And I think your MIT example was spot on about that, is that has been the trend, both by the climate modeling community, but also by the communities who are interested in adaptation, waiting for that to happen before they deal with uncertainty, which, as you pointed out, they're deeply used to thinking about anyway. And for some reason, everyone has gotten wrapped around the idea that we, the climate science community, can do a better job and do better than, say, demography. Where are people going to live in your city? Or where's the economy going to be in 2050? Right. That doesn't seem to bother people. But the climate science, we've oversold what we can tell people about the future in ways that other communities have always said, you know, I've got a bridge for you to buy, you know, or the stock market will be this at this time. So, yeah.
Dorothy Robine, Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy. You didn't talk about the role of the insurance industry. I'm looking for people who have a financial incentive to do something, and they're an obvious one.
Dorothy, thank you for the question. During both this project and thinking about the paper, I dug a little bit into the insurance industry. What I discovered was a certain amount of cynicism about the economic incentive that comes from insurance coverage. Basically, most policies are re-rated and repriced annually. So that commercial real estate insurance or business continuity insurance, basically, they have predictive models to establish a baseline insurance rate, but because they're not, the premiums aren't fixed for a long period. It's not like buying a life insurance policy where they're flat in life, where they guarantee, where TIA Craft gives you 20 years at the same rate. Basically, commercial insurance is re-rated annually, if not annually, every 2 years, which means that while some of the insurance companies do great jobs of prediction, they're really predicting what's going to happen in the next 5 years. And that's all they care about. So I don't think that insurance provides enough economic incentive to do any kind of adaptation except in the very, very short term.
Well, I'm thinking of things like to get homeowners insurance, you have to, have smoke alarms. For earthquake insurance in California, I presume you have to deal with things that could easily fall off. I mean, all those kinds of. But
once again, the issue is the insurance companies are very good at rating the current situation. But the unprecedented uncertainty of what's going to happen as a function of global warming moves the horizon for individuals and for owners of infrastructure or homes beyond the the scope of the insurance company's sort of approach. So you may get an initial rate as a function of having smoke detectors and a fire suppression system. But when they re-rate you 3 years from now, based on the number of wildfires that are occurring in your region, it doesn't matter whether you have the suppression system. It's established a baseline, but they re-rate and increase the policy. So the re-rating process, insurance companies live by re-rating based on the changed risk assessment, and in many cases the risk has little to do with the property or the thing, and it has more to do with the external environment. And as that changes, you'll pay more, and so it provides an economic incentive to get out of the house maybe, or to sell this commercial real estate, to move.
Right.
But it's not an economic incentive it's not a particular economic incentive to do a better job of preparing now. That's what I would say. Is that an adequate answer?
Hi, my name is Melvin Alvarez. I'm with the UN Environmental Program, and I just wanted to see, you mentioned how adaptation is pretty much a political softball, but you didn't really get to talk about the costs associated with adaptation. So can you elaborate a little bit on that? And from what I understand, it seems to be very difficult to sell intense projects with significant costs associated with adaptation. So that's where I'm thinking about this when you classify adaptation as a political softball.
Why don't you go first, Jennifer? The cost piece.
You're absolutely correct that projects that require money are politically unpopular among all parties, generally is the way I would describe it. Mitigation requires money. Adaptation requires money. So what I would say is that it's not a question of it being a softball in terms of actually making something happen. But as a political presentation, you can say, I'm focused on adaptation, we're scraping together the resources, this is important. And you will get, I think, a positive political response from your constituency. We want to be protected from these things. Doesn't mean it's easy to do it. In fact, it means that it's something that you can focus on as a way to, so it's a truly political softball, not necessarily an execution softball. Does that make sense?
I think that's, there's a mayor in Georgia who wanted to, there's a mayor in Georgia who wanted to sort of design a city hall that would be resistant to flooding. And she sort of told me, everybody can get behind a city hall that's resistant to flooding. I'm not talking about why it's going to flood more. I think that's the sense we mean political softball.
Thank you both for presenting. I'm Johanna Frisbee. I'm a policy intern at American Forests. And I just have a question about ways that you can present options for all, because you mentioned the recovering after hurricanes and like having those popularly unrepresented communities that are most at danger. And I had the opportunity to go to Germany last fall for the COP23 conference, and we got to tour a town in Germany that was really sustainable. It was really great. That was wonderful, but it was also insanely expensive and really inaccessible. So I'm curious as to how you can make those, like how to make those funds accessible to those communities for everyone, because often those are the least accessible for those that need it.
I'll give you an example from New Orleans that I thought was pretty successful. So this is a project that involved city residents in collecting stories and data about flooding in their city. And they were able to do two things with that data. One is they actually contributed it back to the National Weather Service, and the Weather Service used it to update their hydrological models, how they predict where flooding was going to occur. I think that's sort of cool because I'm a weather geek. The second thing, though, was that they actually went to city council and were able to demonstrate that their region was prone to flooding and amend an RFP that the city was releasing for plans to redevelop areas to include their neighborhood. And it hadn't been included before. That's a very small scale example, but I think it begins with making sure that those communities are at the beginning of the political process, not at the end. And one way to do that is to make sure they have, to help them develop the tools and language that connects with what they already know and amplifies what they already know through science.
Okay, we want to remain on time here in deference to people's schedules. One last fairly efficient question. So, sir.
Joe Rauscher at spacefaring-services.com. I've been tasked by colleagues in the space community to begin development of a public-private partnership consortium to use space technology to address energy needs to mitigate possible climate change. And I'm a little nervous about where to begin. I need advice because I don't want to reinvent the wheel, and I want to have some partners with some clout, and I just don't know where to begin. If you have any suggestions, I'll be around after the session, but if you want to talk a little bit about this briefly, I'd appreciate it now. Thank you.
We should talk after the session. The answer is, as I said earlier, there is a wealth of environments where people are bringing new technology to bear on alternative energy, improving the environment or reducing the environmental consequences of burning fossil fuel. You name it. There's a huge R&D enterprise. So I don't know what you mean by space technology, but my guess is unless it's really, really, really unique, it's redundant, isn't it? Unless it's unique, somebody's already working in a very close space. And what you want to do is find those folks and make sure that you're aligned with them.
Okay, great. So thank you, Raj and Bruce. Thank you all for participating. This event is not over, but the formal aspect of it is over, and we do encourage you again to hang out as long as you can, as long as you like, finish our coffee and food, chat with Bruce and Raj as long as you're able to hang around, and come back next time. I think next time actually is September 5th. We're going to have a book event, an incredibly interesting book about termites by Lisa Marginelli, who's a fabulous writer, and Richard Harris, the NPR science reporter, will also be here. So if you're around on Wednesday the 5th, that will be interesting, I think, for everyone. But a round of applause, please, for our speakers. And I just want to end by voicing my own appreciation, because I think this maybe is an issue whose time has finally come, and I think it's going to make a decisive difference in our ability to really make progress on the climate change front. So thanks a lot.
You're already indeed